I'd like to tell you something about Jim Crow. Um, in order to tell you some more about Jim Crow, I will try to answer the following question. How democratic was post-war American democracy? First of all, I will talk about democracy itself. How can we define it? What are important criteria for talking about democracy? Then we'll take a look at post-war American democracy, then at Jim Crow itself. We'll have a brief look at what came after Jim Crow, how it ended, or well, if it ended, and then I will sum my key points up in a short summary, and then I'll finish with conclusion. Now, first of all, what are key characteristics of democracy? I'm following a definition by Christoph Nonn, 2014. You'll find it in my works cited at the end of the presentation. First of all, universal suffrage is obviously the most important characteristic. So the right to vote for everybody, regardless of race, gender, sex, etc. Pluralism is often considered equally important. A certain diversity of political and social institutions, diversity of political parties, for instance, being considered as a key characteristic of democracy. To put it bluntly, if there's only one party to vote for, that's not democracy. In a democracy, Parliament should have the power, or at least most of the power. This usually goes hand in hand with a limitation of state power. A separation of powers is usually the key mechanism for this. The rule of law is often considered to be extremely important. Nobody is beyond the law. And of course, the rights of the individual and these rights are protected by law. Now, let's take a look at post-war American democracy. With post-war, I mean 1940s, 1950s, maybe early 1960s, this period. First of all, the US Constitution guaranteed universal suffrage in the 1940s, 1950s. The 14th Amendment, passed after the Civil War in the 19th century, protected equal rights. The 15th Amendment, 1870, guarantees the suffrage for everybody, universal suffrage, regardless of ethnicity, skin color, or former status as a slave. Pluralism. Next, the next aspect, the next part of the definition. The United States is a two-party system. That doesn't sound like a lot of political diversity. Of course, there are other parties, but their political relevance is fairly small, if not insignificant. Well, that's maybe too much, but their political influence is fairly small. However, both parties, Democrats and Republicans, they cover a wide spectrum of political beliefs, or at least they used to do that. In post-war America, in the 1950s, especially, many people considered American society to be a triple melting pot. A melting pot understood as a form of society where immigrants enter the country and then they discard their former cultural traits, beliefs, traditions, not entirely, but they give most of them up in order to become Americans. Still, this triple melting pot was believed to have three major religious influences: Protestantism, Catholicism, and Judaism. Protestantism, the most important one. Of course, there were other faiths as well, but they were really on the margins of things. I should look into the camera, yeah, and be in the focus. So, various media. That was the case in post-war America. There was a variety of media, not as much as today, but still, yes. So we can say that there was pluralism in post-war American society. Parliament has the power, a key aspect. Well, the Constitution demands that Congress is responsible for the legislative branch, and this is mostly true. Especially at that time. I mean, nowadays the executive, led by the president, has acquired at least some of the legislative powers that used to belong to Congress. Yeah, executive orders are used to circumvent Congress sometimes. Yeah, but that was not really the case in the 1950s, as far as I know. At least not in any systematic manner. And of course, Congress had the responsibility to control the executive. And it seems to me that this is also something that is at least in doubt nowadays. A limitation of state power. Yeah, I've mentioned the 14th Amendment, equal rights and protection under the law, as well as a system of checks and balances. Yeah, this is usually what many Americans are proud of when they think of their constitutional system. The first democracy, but still a good system based on checks and balances. Of course, it has weaknesses, and many presidents have tested these weaknesses, and that's what we see right now in the United States as well. The Supreme Court is also an example of an independent judiciary. Again, this is something that has been in doubt and is in doubt at the moment, but on the whole, the Supreme Court does not simply do what the executive tells it. That's simply not the case. And although the Supreme Court has seems at least to have become a partly partisan matter. Now, are all of these criteria met? Unfortunately, not for post-war American society, democracy. And this is where we get to Jim Crow. This is Jumping Jim Crow, a fictional character, often portrayed by whites with black makeup. It's called blackface, or the minstrel tradition, whites putting on black makeup to mock African Americans. While Jumping Jim Crow was a favorite, a comical character, always happy but also always lazy. Yeah, really an awful racist stereotype. Yeah, and the system that emerged after the Civil War, or that was actually created, I should say, after the Civil War, takes its name in the southern states, takes its name from Jumping Jim Crow. Now, the key to understanding Jim Crow is to understand that although African Americans had the right to vote, remember the 14th and 15th Amendments, in the South, people found ways to circumvent the right of the vote for African Americans. There was political equality before the law, but only but only on paper, you might say. And there were certain methods that were used to, as I said, circumvent the vote. There were literacy tests, so you had to be able to read in order to vote, or if you could, maybe you were asked tricky constitutional questions about extremely complex matters that you would have to explain in order to see whether you'd have understood what you just read. So most people wouldn't have been able to answer these questions. Poll taxes were also used because most African Americans after the Civil War were too poor to afford to pay them, basically. Yeah. Of course, this will also hit poor whites, yeah, but it hit African Americans worse, and that's often the point with racist policies. Gerrymandering, that's something that's still very popular in the United States, or infamous, I should say. It's basically redrawing the district boundaries to discriminate against black voters. Yeah? So you have two districts, and you redraw the boundaries of the district in a way that you have a majority, or that there's a majority for one of the two parties. In the South, the Democrats used to control politics and the government. So gerrymandering was used to ensure this democratic majority. Yeah, as I've mentioned, it's still practiced today, although it is formally forbidden to use it for racial discrimination, but gerrymandering regularly makes the news for being abused. Yeah, white primaries, very important. So elections before the elections to determine parties' candidates for the elections, for the actual elections. Yeah. And in these primaries, only white voters were permitted. Yeah. And since the Democrats were the only party with a chance for success, yeah, this really deprived African Americans of their political influence. And of course, we've seen this. You've seen this on the cover of this presentation: threats of violence, especially lynchings. Yeah, you see the statistic here. Manfred Berg, a German historian who has studied lynchings in the American South, he has counted 4,716 lynchings between 1882 and 1946, and yeah, as you can see, lynchings decreased, fortunately, over time. But the sad and tragic debate about police violence in the United States today is evidence enough that violence in the criminal justice system, or tolerated by the criminal justice system, as in the case of lynchings, has a long history and is by no means ended. Yeah, how is this possible? So lynchings were tolerated by the majority of people in Southern society. Congress offered an official apology in 2005, but the phantom, what Manfred Berg has called the phantom of the black rapist, so the fiction of the black rapist, is still haunts American society, you might say. Yeah, so violence is still justified with this phantom of the black rapist, yeah, as well as tough laws. Maybe you remember Hillary Clinton, or maybe you've heard Hillary Clinton say in the last presidential election talk about super predators, African American super predators. It's that kind of yeah, fiction, yeah, that African American males are more likely to rape women than, especially white women, yeah, than white males. And that's a lie, of course. So racial segregation in all areas of life in order to uphold white supremacy. The official justification was separate but equal, that there was supposed to have been, or allegedly actually, equality, but that the two ethnicities had to be separate in all, separated in all areas of life. They were in separate schools, and of course the schools for African Americans were inferior. There was inferior public transport. The jobs that African Americans were able to get were inferior, and so on and so forth. It was a system built to discriminate against African Americans. Yeah, as I've said, lynchings decreased over time, especially since the 1930s. And what I'd like to talk about now is how Jim Crow ended, or actually whether if it ended at all. Yeah. So Brown versus Board of Education, a key ruling by the Supreme Court in 1952. Earlier Supreme Courts had supported the Jim Crow system. Now, in 1954, the Supreme Court decided that segregation in the school system was illegal. This did not stop segregation at first. It took a while, and the federal government had to intervene as well in order to put this into reality. But this effectively ended segregation in schools and put the entire system of racial segregation into doubt. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibited the discriminatory practices that were used in Southern elections, like literacy tests, poll taxes, and so on and so forth. Yeah, why have I said that? Why did I say that Jim Crow may not have ended? A couple of years ago, there was a very important book that came out by Michelle Alexander, termed "The New Jim Crow," and since then people have been discussing the term "the New Jim Crow." So, is there a new Jim Crow? Well, what people usually mean when they talk about the new Jim Crow is a return of voter suppression laws, especially in the late 20th and the early 21st century. This year, we might see much more voter suppression than in the years before. That's at least what the press reports, the liberal press. We'll see. What this means is that there are laws in some states that make it deliberately harder for people of color to vote. For instance, voter ID laws. And of course, voter ID laws, so laws making it mandatory that you have to show some kind of identification, in addition to your registration for the election, hits people of color usually harder than whites, simply because that's a question of social class. Poor people tend to have less or fewer means of identification. The new Jim Crow, yeah. The most important aspect of what Michelle describes as the new Jim Crow is discrimination in the criminal justice system. Beginning with the well, not beginning, but worsening with the war on drugs in the 1980s and 1990s. resulting in numerous imprisonments, especially of African Americans. Why African Americans? Because the law was prejudiced, or is prejudiced against them. So there are more checks by the police. The law discriminated against different forms of drugs. In the 1990s, there was this discussion about cocaine, I think. Yeah. And from what I know, it's not that African Americans used to buy cocaine more frequently than whites, but they the cocaine, the so-called crack cocaine, yeah, was more widespread among black drug users than among white drug users. Yeah, and the law discriminated against people using crack cocaine by making sure that the punishments were much harder. Yeah, the reason why this is called the New Jim Crow is that prisoners are often deprived of the right to vote. So even if you're only for an extremely brief time, if you're in prison only for an extremely brief time, you're still deprived of the right to vote in some states in the United States, and often even for many years after your sentences have ended. And so that is a serious problem, especially since many African Americans, not only but especially African Americans, end up in prison for minor offenses. That's why they are overrepresented in prison. Yeah, you've all seen the images of police shootings, and often police officers are not charged. So that's also a reason why people have criticized or have been criticizing the criminal justice system. What we see in 2020 and what we've seen in recent years as well are scare tactics to prevent African Americans or people of color in general to go to the ballot box. So especially in this year, armed and private poll watchers, so not official poll watchers, but private people who think that they have a right or duty to make sure that there's no voter fraud. They go to the polling stations and talk to people and watch them, sometimes armed, and this is what we have seen in 2020 so far, and maybe we'll see some more of it in the general elections, in the presidential elections on November 3rd. And of course, warnings against voter fraud, also partly targeting African Americans, in the sense that they have to be afraid that if they make a mistake in some way and in the process, that this might be interpreted as voter fraud, and then there's a high fine or worse. However, the term itself, the New Jim Crow, seems to me that this term is still controversial. Also, the degree of discrimination is controversial. Yeah, so to put it in a nutshell, post-war democracy and its limits, Jim Crow. Yes, there was universal suffrage guaranteed by the Constitution, but in post-war America, the African Americans did not have the right to vote in the South. Yes, there was a certain degree of pluralism, not as much as today, but there was pluralism in the United States. However, people of color were severely discriminated against, and not only people of color, but also other minorities were pushed to the margins, and their voices were often not heard. So, this limited this limited pluralism in post-war American society. Of course, American society also, the political system was based on a system of checks and balances, but in the South, there was really a one-party system, yeah, led by the Democrats, and until this flipped and the Republicans became um, the key party in the South. People, yeah, maybe we'll talk about this at some other time. Yeah, it's called the Southern Strategy or Southern Realignment. Limited state power. Yeah, the system of checks and balances was limited state power. I'm sorry. Yeah. And of course, the rights of black people, of people of color, were limited. Yeah. So, was post-war America a democracy? Yes. Freedom and equality was granted by the Constitution, and yes. But this was only partly realized until the 1960s, and yes, the rule of law was granted by the Constitution, but there was a serious discrimination in the criminal justice system, and of course some of this persists until today. So my conclusion is this, yeah? According to the Constitution, the post-war United States had a democratic form of government, but this was poorly implemented in the southern states. Serious civil and human rights violations were the order of the day. However, the constitutional foundations made it possible for civil rights activists to address the grievances politically and legally. Some democratic deficits still persist today. These are my sources, especially Manfred Berg and Christoph Nonn, the statistics from Ackermann. Thank you very much, and see you later.